Prananda. Sitaki. Yeah, see, Diane. I've learnt a few Welsh words in the 16 years we've lived here. Craig said to me, he said, will you speak at Handheld? I said, I'm not really doing a lot of speaking at the moment, Craig. Sorry about that. And he came back to me last week and said, John Hickson, you can push a Dalek with Ling Valentine in it on stage. I'm like, I'm in. What else does a boy need, really? It's the pinnacle of my career. It's the, I'm never going to top that. Could you indulge me for a moment? Can you just put the house lights up for me, if that's possible? Because this is by far the biggest stage that I have ever been on. Ever, ever, ever. And you're the biggest audience that I've ever been terrified by. So, can you say cheese? What does cheese say when it's having its photograph taken? I've often wondered that. I ponder these things. Why is there only one Monopolies Commission? Why don't people with kleptomania just take something for it? My wife said, don't do comedy, Andy, don't do comedy. Honestly. She went to Tesco last week, took some vinegar back. She said to the girl behind the counter, this vinegar's got lumps in it. The lady said, I'm sorry, madam, they're pickled onions. No, I'm not going to do that. No more, Sue, I promise. That's the end. That's the end. So this is my first big talk in the UK for 2.5 years. And it's my first time speaking in my home country. Believe that? And I think for a lot of us freaking out, particularly about struggling to find our place in this new responsive web design world. And I'm not afraid to say I've had a bit of a crisis of confidence over the last couple of years because, I've not invented any grand concepts. And, there are plenty of other people who are younger and more handsome, well, maybe not. More talented, at least. And I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer anymore when it comes to CSS. But we were talking about what I might talk about today at home. And my wife reminded me, she said, we've got 15 years of running a business together. And for the most part, we keep people happy. And some of how we do that, I want to talk about with you today, really. So this is a talk about what we do. I'm sorry, not a talk about what we do. This is a talk about how we talk about what we do to other people. It's not a technical talk, it's not a creative talk. It's a talk about communication and collaboration and how we can focus conversations to get the very best out of them. And it's about developing relationships with people. And it generally breaks down into 3 main topics. The first one being, responsive design, it's not just our problem as designers and developers. It's about why the typical process for client participation is broken for the most part, and what we can do to try to fix it. And finally, my favorite bit is how you can call your client or your boss an idiot to their face without getting fired. And there's no guarantees on that one, by the way. No legal advice given, representative 2000% APR, not tested on animals, especially chimpanzees. Man, you couldn't expect me to do a whole talk without mentioning chimpanzees at some point. So we've had to deal with a lot of these issues in my business over the last few years. And that's because doing what we do and the ways that we do it have fundamentally changed. Largely due to the rise of mobile and the necessity for multi-screen, some might say responsive design. And every problem that I've ever had running a creative business has been magnified by responsive design over the last few years. And as someone who buys and sells creative services, I've had to reevaluate almost every facet of my business because of responsive design. Right the way from who I hire to how I schedule and even what I invoice. And that's a process that many organizations, I think, still aren't going through. So let's talk about why responsive design isn't just our problem. Now, I imagine that there's a lot of us here getting, still very excited about responsive design. I've become less interested really in how we do what we do, and more interested in how we talk to each other. And you might be inspired by the creative possibilities, or you might want to solve technical challenges when it comes to responsive design. But the trouble is that in all the excitement about responsive design, someone forgot to tell the boss that it's as much their problem as it is ours. And the challenges of responsive design are not just in design and in implementation. As a designer, I focus on design challenges. That's what I like to do, and there are plenty of them. If you think about it off the top of my head, there are the whole complexities about multi-screen layout decisions. Maybe our use of grids and how they adapt across different screen sizes. We've got adaptive typography and decisions about how we optimize readability of type across devices. And then we should also be concerned about ergonomics too. This often gets forgotten. And how our design actually feels when somebody holds it in their hand. And then there's performance, and not just in terms of download speed, but also how an interface performs, real responsiveness. So let's remind ourselves and others that responsive design, it also creates challenges for businesses and for the other people that work with us in them. And that's something I don't think we're dealing with as effectively as we're attempting to fix design and implementation challenges. If you think about it, responsive design, it's an issue for everyone that's involved in the design process from start to finish, including people who are potentially involved in what I would term pre-design planning. So, you count researchers, information specialists, content specialists in that kind of group. You've got to include people that commission websites as well. I mean, that's not just external clients. That could be your boss or your manager in your company or your organization, if you have those. The plain fact is that it's those people that need to consider new ways to buy and work on and even pay for responsive design. Because the current methods, the methods that we've been using for such a long time, they're proving ineffective. And then finally, there are people who structure teams of creative and technical people to work on designing and developing websites. And I'd love to think that there are some of those people in the audience, because you could make everybody's life a whole lot easier. So many problems that we face every day when we're designing and developing, they stem often from the workflow. That's not something that we can easily control. It's something that's often decided for us based on the needs or the goals of the business that we work in. And, one obvious goal is making money, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very admirable goal. We need to have business in order to do the work that we do. So we need to focus really on how we organize our organizations. And I think there's a common workflow that we see when we're making websites. Maybe it will sound familiar to you. We start off with what I've called pre-design planning. So that's researching, gathering content, structuring information. And then we get on to designing. So visual design. I'm really always a bit unsure about that word. That's color, texture, typography, and then layout. Then there's development, so markup, style sheets, scripting, and then there's deployment, actually making the thing. That's the thing that I try and stay as far away from as I can. So if we break down those steps a little bit more, we might roll into pre-planning things like content audits or requirements gathering, user research, information architecture. When I was planning this talk, I looked up the definition of user experience design on Wikipedia. I didn't memorize the whole thing, obviously. But the first part roughly breaks down into making an audit of site assets, developing flows, navigation maps, user stories, scenarios, personas, and then finally getting onto things like wireframes, which we've used as things like screen blueprints or storyboards. I don't know about you, but I've worked with UX specialists in the past who are so in love with these tools. They work on them for so long that they think that this documentation is an important part of the thing that we're making as part of a deliverable. And I've got a real problem, actually, with any part of any process that limits my potential for creative experimentation, because that's a key part of the process for me. In particular, I've always had a problem with wireframes because I've seen them used really badly across several projects. Mainly I think it's because wireframes are produced often and shown to, and even worse, signed off by a client long before those things ever arrive in a design studio. I've seen across different projects, some of them small, some of them large, that when wireframes are used in the wrong way, when they're really prescriptive, they can just reduce design to coloring in between the lines. I think I mentioned this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, that we received an inquiry, as we do every now and again, from a potential customer, and actually mentioned in the opening letter that they'd already completed UX design, and they'd produced wireframes, and they had developers lined up. What they were looking for, they actually called a website stylist. Can you imagine the look on my face when I read that? It was not a happy bunny. So I think that the major problem with wireframes is not what they set out to achieve, which is a low-fidelity exploration of content or functionality. It's how easily they set expectations in the minds of the people that we ask to judge them. They become no longer the tool for the process, they become something for people to fixate on. And this is especially evident in expectations that they set about layout. I was working with an external UX company on a project recently, and the client made it absolutely clear to me that the wireframes were just there to define content structure. The trouble was that they looked at those wireframes for so long that the layout became really familiar. They became ingrained in their heads. So ingrained, in fact, that it was almost impossible to design alternative layouts away from them. The other problem was that those wireframes were desktop only. And that became a real stumbling block because we needed to design different layouts to cater for multiple screens. Last year, I worked on a big government project, and for that, the wireframes had been produced by the consulting company's UX team. And once again, these were wireframes that were desktop only, and the way that the elements were arranged on the page, they didn't allow for those elements to properly flow in a linear order for smaller screens. For example, there were two main areas of functionality on the page. Start a new claim, edit an existing claim, and the two things were side by side. Except there was quite a lot of guff that went under I think it was guff. They thought it was content that went under these buttons. So that actually, if you folded things onto a smaller screen, that second option of editing an existing claim just wasn't visible on a smaller screen unless somebody had scrolled to find it. So it was less than optimal. And when we mentioned changing the visual order to accomplish that and to do something a little more flexible, we were told we couldn't. And we were told the reason for that was that the wireframes had been shown to and signed off by the client 3 months earlier. So I found that in organizations like that, it's typical for designers to receive wireframes that have been prepared by somebody else. And they might be really skilled at what they do, but they might not always be qualified to make decisions that affect layout, particularly decisions that affect layout in a responsive context. And the wireframes that we so often receive are more than likely fixed width, one size, usually desktop derived. And that's not especially helpful in informing us about other screen sizes. So what are the alternatives? Well, maybe we could just do 2 sets of wireframes or 3 sets of wireframes, but that just sounds like 3 times the misery to me. Now, I don't know what your solution should be, but if your solution's anything like ours, moving from documentation to better communication, that should be a big part of it. And I know that people often say, a picture says 1,000 words. Is that the phrase? But what I've found is that clever written description, rather than an illustration, leaves the door open more often to designing a solution and not following one that's just been suggested to us. So in this stage, the waterfall workflow that we're talking about, we get to design, and that's where you'll find, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to say this, a creative team. They work on visual design quite often. And that could be a range of activities. It could be branding, look and feel, graphic design, layout design, more. And that's where we'll find people making what I've termed static visuals. You might call them comps or PSDs. And these aren't simply a tool for creative experimentation and expression, which is where they're really valuable. They've become the currency of web design. And what do I mean by that? I mean that designers, we exchange them with clients for sign-off and approval and for money too. And then clients and designers exchange them with developers to use as blueprints or as QA tools. How often you've worked on a project where somebody somewhere has compared the final website to a PSD? Yeah, I know. It's not a terribly pleasant thing, is it? In reality, these static visuals, they are terribly ill-equipped for any of these roles. But the real problem is not with Photoshop comps. The problem's not with Photoshop itself. It's really not with the visuals themselves. But with the lack of communication that often goes along with them. Because too often, what we do as designers is we use those visuals in place of conversation, not as tools for conversation. We hide behind them. And we try to let those designs, those visuals, do the talking for us. And unfortunately, so much gets left to interpretation when we do that. So more on that in a minute. And then we get to development. We get to front-end HTML, CSS, JavaScript, performance engineering. And in a lot of organizations I visit, developers work separately from designers. And they sometimes have quite a limited interaction with them. And then we get onto the bit that I really don't understand. We get onto the whole kind of deployment area. And I know I make light of it, but I really, truly have no idea what people do there. Databases and CMS and stuff. They're like black magic. Black ops sounds a bit cooler. But. Now this method, this process, this workflow, we can describe as waterfall. And this reminds me really quite a lot of the pre-press workflow that I worked in pre-digital photography back in the 90s. And it seems like a long time ago. But I worked with a lot of the first digital cameras that came into the country. They were quite fun. Anybody work in digital photography back then? Oh, man, probably just me. The first cameras that came into the country, we digress a bit. I'll go into my digressing corner. They were made by a company called Leaf, which they fitted onto the back of a Hasselblad camera. These things were huge. They were like a house brick. And they stuck on the back of a Hasselblad. There's all these cables sprouting out of them. We had two in our house once. They were worth more than the bloody house. They were about £40,000 each, these things back then. They had a CCD size. It was 2048 by 2048 pixels. And they couldn't take a moving picture in color. They were purely black and white. So to get a color picture, you had to take 3 shots with a filter wheel, and then the computer combined them together. It's quite fun. So if you think about the workflow back then, think about the 7 steps that we had to get a piece of film, a transparency piece of film, straight out of the camera and onto a printed page. We had a photographer. That was his role. He would hand that to a processing lab who would process the film. And from there, we'd go to a scanner operator, usually a high-definition Crossfield Cytex drum scanner, to scan the film. Then it would go on to a color conversion or color specialist to do the RGB to CMYK conversion for print. And then for the client to see a proof, we would actually have to plot that image to a series of films. So we had somebody that would, like in DTP, that would actually just create a page. Somebody that would actually output the 4 color sheets of film, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and then there was a proofer, an analog proofer. So 7 people were involved in taking a single transparency piece of film from the camera to a proof. And it was interesting that, like now, each person's work was an opportunity for somebody to sign something off. You sign off the color conversion, you sign off the processing, you sign off the original shot in the camera. But most importantly, it was an opportunity for billing too. You could charge people at those stages. So if you think about the little arrows that might go between each of those stages in a diagram, you can just easily replace them with ticks or dollar signs or pound signs. Because as well as handing over responsibility, people were handing over money at that point too. And that's pretty much what our website design process looks like now. Fixed sign-off points that often make it really difficult to go back stages. And that's often what we need to do, because in a responsive world, we can't possibly predict at the start of a project everything we're going to need right the way through it. And that's why I think it's impossible to write a functional specification that can take into account all the complexities of a responsive design, particularly when we have technology that moves so quickly. So that's why we, designers, developers, managers, business owners, we need to work out a more flexible approach to design. And we need to work out one that meets the needs of the business but doesn't compromise the work that we do. So if we think about a more, let's say, agile workflow, we can still do planning like we did before, but that planning is going to be open-ended so that we can reassess any requirements that we have all the way through, and we can react to changes when we need to. We can combine design and front-end development into a much more agile, iterative process. And your designers, you can still use your traditional graphic tools if you want to, Photoshop or fireworks. I have a really sad face when I talk about fireworks. It's my favorite thing. John and I can mourn fireworks later. But we combine those traditional graphics tools with code because we want to design for the medium by using the medium. And this is an agile-style, iterative process that we've been working with at my company, and we've seen a lot of benefits from it. Everybody works really more closely together. We go from sketching to building fast prototypes to testing and redesigning, and we do all of this with the client in the room where we can. Because it's not just designers and developers who can work together better. We should be bringing clients into the heart of the design process and asking for their involvement at every stage, not just when we want to get paid. And that means working really closely with people than possibly we've done before. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, doesn't it? The thought of the client sitting there, looking over your shoulder, perhaps. But, and I might digress again for a minute, it's really important when we get into this kind of design testing phase that we think about involving clients. I mean, I keep a lot of phones and tablets on my desk when I'm working, and I use tools like Hammer and GhostLab to sync everything up. And, it's great for me when I actually have clients that will, perhaps will run workshops and will bring everybody together, and they can just bring their own devices and we can test and play along the way. This is sort of a difference between design testing and device testing in a way. I don't need to own like 1 million devices or set up some kind of test lab. I'm not really concerned about whether a menu works on an old Android phone. I just want to make sure that the thing feels right. That's a design issue, not a deployment issue. So what matters to me is that we create designs that have an affinity for the device that things sit on. And that's important, particularly when we bring clients into the process. Now, I've come to the conclusion that it's agencies, businesses, companies, our customers, they need to refactor how they're going to commission and engage and pay for responsive design projects too. They need to think about restructuring their buying process. And outside companies, they need to think about how they commission websites differently. So, we still get occasionally prospective clients that ask us just for static comps, for static visuals, because they assume that that's what designers do. And you can't blame them for that, really. That's what they've come to expect. That's what they've been given for over a decade. And some of them are quite surprised, actually, when we say, no, we go beyond that. We deliver code as our main deliverable. And they love it because, best of all, they can get their hands on it much quicker, much more easily, and feel much more part of the process. They can make it much more their own. And how they feel, how a client feels as they're working, that's part of the experience of dealing with us. We're not just selling websites. We're selling the experience of dealing with our customers. And we should want to make them as happy as we can. In-house organizations, they need to think more differently about how they structure teams so designers and developers can work together. Designers need to know about code, They don't need to know how to make complex layouts, but they need to understand what the code does. And at the same time, developers need to understand much more about creative aspects, design aspects of a project, understanding things like layout proportions and typographic rules. A lot of the time those skills are quite complementary. So responsive design isn't just a challenge for us, it's a challenge for everyone that's involved in the process. And we shouldn't look at these challenges as problems. What they are is they're opportunities to reshape things so that that's better for everyone. So if we think about this client participation process, from my experience anyway, the process of engagement, how we get people to participate in design, is often less than satisfactory. I build websites for people. That's what we do. I design websites, I should say, for what we do. And I want to do my best work, like I hope everybody else does. But unfortunately, the ways that we and our clients as an industry have communicated in the past has more often led to frustration than anything else, unhappiness, and perhaps most importantly, work that sometimes fails to meet everyone's expectations, and that makes me sad. So if we think for a moment about the media that we use to communicate designs to clients, most often these are just artifacts, sketches, wireframes, static visuals. We use them, we throw them away. Aside from a few kind of image assets, and a lot of those are being replaced by CSS, there's very little about what we make in Photoshop that ends up in the finished website. And a lot of the drawing tools that we use, Photoshop included, that predates the web, so they're not equipped to communicate responsive designs to people. If you think about what they can't do, they can't demonstrate liquid layouts or media queries, even silly things like native form styling, font rendering, flexible leading and measure in typography. And then there's a browser's capability to render CSS. They can't demonstrate any of that. Well, I said easily, but you could end up making lots and lots of different Photoshop comps that would show off different hover states. But that's time that you could better spend being creative, really. So I'm not saying that we have to design in the browser. That's the one approach. It's a valid approach. But it's just one. We can still use our traditional tools if we want to design what I call the atmosphere, typography, color, texture, line art, for developing those kind of fine details that we really need those tools for. So I haven't thrown Photoshop or Fireworks out of the window. I still use those tools at different parts of the process. I design the atmosphere usually before I do anything else. And then I might go from pencil sketches of layouts into code quite quickly, so I can solve UI problems. I can get things on devices really quickly. And you arrive at a prototype so that people can really get it in their hands and feel how it's going to work. But the overall look of that can be a bit soulless. That's often a criticism of things that have been designed in the browser, in inverted commas. But there's no reason why you can't go back into a graphics tool at that point to work on those fine details. There's nothing like zooming into 800% and just checking that gradient is right, or that drop shadow is just thick enough. People still use drop shadows and gradients, by the way. Not everything's gone flat. The big problem with these static visuals, the big problem with Photoshop comps, is that they're completely superficial. They're like high fructose, they're extra sweet. Everybody really loves them, but they've got no nutritional value as far as the project's concerned. And no matter how many of these Photoshop comps a client sees, they're always going to want more. And that's the problem. They're incredibly poor communication tools. So much of what we need to communicate gets left to interpretation. So they're not the right tools for the job. They're bringing a knife to a gunfight. And one of the revelations I've had about designing responsive sites for a while is that in the past, we've created this all-in-one comp. Everything's resolved around that. And in that comp, we're mixing lots and lots of different aspects of design into one artifact. And because of that, when we have conversations with clients, we're having multiple conversations, all about different topics, more or less at the same time, because we're looking at that one artifact. So maybe we want to talk about typography, but the client, they keep getting distracted because all they can see is the size of the logo. I know that's a cliche. Other times we might want to talk about layout, but they're just going to get fixated on the fact that we've used an out-of-date product photo. And you can't really blame them for that. How often has a client said to you, I'm not sure about the design? When actually what they really mean is, I want the sidebar to be on the left and not on the right. That often happens. So we need to have more focused conversations. And we need to realize that layout is only one component of design these days. And when we take layout away, what we're left with is atmosphere. And that's the color and the typography and the texture. And by texture, I mean decorative elements, line work, patterns, shapes, that kind of thing. These are the aspects of design that transcend layout. They're going to be the same at all screen sizes, all layout configurations. So you can design styles for those things. Buttons, tables, plenty of other elements. And they're going to be the same, whatever device you're going to view them on. They'll feel the same. So that's why I more or less start off every project now, working on these elements away from the distractions of layout. And people have been advocating this recently. Brad Frost has been pushing this approach. Mark Bolton's been a little bit more skeptical. But what matters really is not how we design, but how we communicate the design that we make. That's the important point. So worse than being inefficient communication tools, these static visuals, they set the wrong expectations in the mind of the client. If you think about it, why do you think in the old days so many websites were fixed and centered at 960? Could that have been because that's what the designer showed the client and that what was signed off, and then that was what was given to the developer to build? We were forcing ourselves into that situation. When we sold a design, and then the client came back and said, hang on a minute, can I really not have rounded corners in an old version of Internet Explorer? Whose fault was that? It was our fault. It was our stupid fault, nobody else, because we sent the wrong message with the visual that we sold. So you can carry on using Photoshop or Fireworks or Sketch or whatever you want, if that's right for you, but be careful not to set the wrong expectations. And in my experience, the worst thing that you can do is to show a client a static visual. Instead, what we could do is to demonstrate something which is much more meaningful, a prototype that they can really, really hold in their hands. And that's where clients really love to be involved. They love to get their hands on things. They love to feel that they're a part of the process, not just buying something from a vendor. We might think that our design is perfect. We've worked on it for a while. We've sweated every detail. But clients, they want to put their mark on it. They want to leave something of themselves inside a design because, they love to make it theirs as well, not just something that they're paying for. And, that's no different to anybody else. When you get a decorator coming around in your house, you're making choices, you want something to be yours. You're not just buying something from a vendor. And sometimes, those suggestions add real value to a project. Other times, we as designers sometimes think that they're unnecessary. We think that even though they're probably best made with the best intentions, they're not really contributing to the correct design direction that we think is right for the project. And some people, I don't count myself among them, they think that client feedback dilutes the good work that we do. Some people think that clients get in the way of great work. You ever heard that? Man, it'd be okay if we didn't have clients. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. But sometimes, occasionally, we get suggestions. People make suggestions. And we think that they're dumb. And I've realized, maybe through experience, that it's actually okay to tell people when we think that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the best thing to do, is just to avoid all of those issues completely. And do that by communicating everything better. So here's some rules that I now follow. And I suggest you think about them too. Never, ever, ever email a picture of a website to your client and then just ask for their thoughts. Are you mad? What do you expect them to say? In the same way, don't just upload a static comp to Basecamp and then expect any kind of constructive feedback without providing some direction on how to receive it. Yet don't wait until after weeks and weeks of work before having a big reveal. Now, this isn't some kind of home decorating show. Down the road leads frustration and often resentment, and that's not what we want in a creative project. Instead, what we should do is we should keep clients involved at every step of the process, all the way through, and not just at those traditional sign-off points. And that's why I've tried really hard over the last couple of years to physically work alongside clients as often as I can. And when it's not an option, I will set up a shared Dropbox folder. We'll have daily Skype calls. We'll keep a Skype line completely open all the time so that they can ask questions, they can provide feedback, they can look in Dropbox, they can see what we're doing as we're doing it. And occasionally, they'll get scared. Occasionally, they'll open up a PSD or a PDF or something like that, or they'll look at a piece of code and they'll go, oh my God, that's not what the website's going to look like, is it? We go, no, calm down. Exactly the kind of thing that Mark was talking about earlier. But again, that's a communication issue. Setting out the process is incredibly important, and having our clients understand that the process that they may have had before when they've worked on a design project may not be the same as the process that they're going to be involved in now. So set up a proper environment for receiving structured feedback. And I've actually banned all unstructured feedback now. We don't accept any feedback by email or phone unless it's part of a structured process. And we tell clients that, and largely they accept it. We try to insist that our feedback sessions happen face-to-face, and that's not always possible, particularly when you're working with clients around the world. But there's technical ways in which we can do this over the web, obviously. Ask questions, ask for answers about specific questions that you have about typeface choices, typography in general, color, layout. Ask for specific feedback. And on some of the projects I've worked on over the last year or so, we've helped to do that by facilitating structured feedback workshops with the client. Often what we'll do is we'll take over a room in their place, and we'll invite everybody in the organization to come along to that, see what we're doing, provide feedback on certain aspects of the design. And bring along devices too. Help us to actually do some device testing when they pull out some Windows phone. So finally, the bit that we've been kind of leading up to, which is how you can call your client an idiot without getting fired. And maybe you can even have them thank you for it afterwards. Well, we've got to remember as designers and as developers that we are the people that have been hired to solve a problem that a client either couldn't or doesn't have the time to solve themselves. Our solution is worth a lot to their business. So the thing that we must never, ever do is to underestimate the importance of our role and our skills and the influence that we have in the design process. We are the specialists. Somebody may be paying us for our time or for a solution, but that does not put them in control. We are the specialists. Don't misunderstand me. This isn't about ego. It's not about prima donna designers ignoring any criticism or any kind of contrary opinion. It's about respect for the work. And with that in mind, we can set rules about how we receive constructive, structured feedback so that can feed in to making a great design, which is what's really important. So rule number 1 is, as I mentioned before, don't ask for unstructured feedback by email. Just don't upload or email a static comp. It doesn't cut it anymore. We've got to control the discussion so that we can get what we want out of it. So take the time to explain to people the design thinking behind the decisions that we've made. And I think that because of that approach, clients that we've worked with anyway, they love learning about what goes into the process of making a design. And when they understand that stuff, they're far less likely to want to kind of make changes, just to simply put their mark on a project. So rule number 2, take control of the environment in which we present the designs. Host feedback workshops, Mark calls them design crits. Use them to get to know your client better. You're sitting in a room with them, you're talking to them on a regular basis. So you can use those opportunities to really develop a deeper relationship with people. And try to make them face to face. I was working over in Geneva for more or less 6 weeks through the course of this year, and I spent like 3-4 days a week there, getting to know the people that we were working with. And even when I wasn't there, setting up regular Skype conversations, just so people could feel comfortable about what was happening. And where these workshops work best is where everybody's encouraged to be honest. They can get their ideas out into the open. Nothing's sacred. Here's one that always raises a few eyebrows. One rule that we have is we have to make it clear to our clients that it's only people that show up to any kind of design workshop that are allowed an opinion on the design. And that includes the CEO. He can't just make helpful suggestions 24 hours before the launch or when you want to get paid, unless he's been involved in the process. This is incredibly important. Rule number 3 is remind everybody that we're talking about the work. What matters is our creative output or technical output. So it's hard for everybody, but we've got to try and leave feelings at the door. These things aren't precious. And when we're talking about design, it's really only the work that matters. Everybody has their personal feelings, but that's not really what's at stake. We want to be having conversations where clients can really openly express their opinions. They can speak their mind. They can be brutally honest. They can say, that looks great, or they can say, that looks appalling. If you're printing stuff out, that's fine. They can scribble all over it. I don't mind. These things are kind of tools for jobs. They encourage them to get their point across and be really open and honest in the feedback to the work that we're making. But by the same token, we're free to disagree with any of the suggestions that they make. Just because they're paying us does not mean that we have to do what they want. We're free to say that suggestions that they might have made aren't going to work. They can suggest better alternatives. It's not about ego. It's about the integrity of the work. And if you feel that they're not listening, well, call them an idiot if you want to. Now, contrary to the title of the talk, I almost never actually call anybody an idiot. I certainly would never call somebody stupid. But what they suggest sometimes can be stupid. There's a distinction. So we can call them. We can tell them that. It's okay. We can say it to their face. And we shouldn't really worry about getting fired, because if we've established a really good relationship with the people that we're working with, they're going to understand that we've got their interests at heart and that we're passionate about doing our best work, and they'll thank us for it. So, Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very, very much.